Hey everybody. Like I said, Greene-Dennis here, back. And like I said, I will be doing live readings Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 4 p.m. And yeah. Hey, what's up? What's up? What's up? So Mayday. What's up? Just wait a few more minutes. But while I do, I might as well say I don't want this to be like a substitute for like actual live audiobook narrations. What I want to do is like cold read, live read, and react to what I'm reading as well. What I feel is very important that doesn't get enough push or exposure that I feel that it should. So I want to think of this as like a live read and react in real time to books like this. In about a minute or so, I think I'll start this live read. By the way, just to give a little heads up, One Nation Under Blackmail, Vol.1, Chapter 3. And this chapter is about organized crime in the state of Israel. So this could get really juicy and interesting. Few more. All right, let me get started. Yeah. So let me get started. For those who are just coming in, Paul Greene-Dennis here, aka Deep Green VO. I like to do for this reading, I like to think of it as like live cold read and react, if you will, to books like One Nation Under Blackmail, more so nonfiction that I feel like books that should get more exposure. Probably won't, but should. And do a live read and react to these type of books. So with that being said, let me get started. One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1, Chapter 3, Organized Crime and the State of Israel. The first part of this chapter, state building. In its July 1971 obituary for Samuel Brofman, the New York Times wrote that after World War II, the liquor baron had helped finance a secret purchase of Canadian weapons for troops of the Haganah. Additional details on Brofman's role in that purchase, beyond its brief mention by the Times, are rather difficult to come by. Peter Newman, in his otherwise exhaustive The Brofman Dynasty, writes that Sam personally underwrote life insurance policies for Canadian pilots recruited to help Israel fight its 1948 War of Independence. However, it is also known that a few years after Israel's creation, in 1951, Brofman would play a leading role in a similar secret purchase for the Haganah's successor, the Israel Defense Force, IDF. In that case, Brofman specifically answered the call of Israel's Shimon Peres, taking Peres to Ottawa, Canada to negotiate the transfer for $2 million worth of weapons to Israel. Brafman then raised funds to cover the entire cost of the sizable arms cache. Yet, aside from that, little is known of his earlier role in arming Zionist paramilitaries prior to Israel's founding. As Newman noted, Brafman preferred to remain tight-lipped to Zionist matters, despite his position as head of the Canadian Jewish Congress, an example of the family's characteristic quiet manipulation. Regardless of the exact nature of Brafman's activities in this area, his connection to the Haganah was not quite for those in his social circles. Thank you. Let me go back a little bit. Regardless of the exact nature of Brafman's activities in this area, his connection to the Haganah was not quite for those in his social circles. Yet, even outside of Brafman's contacts, efforts to aid the Zionist paramilitary group, which would later form the backbone of the IDF, were already indicative of a wider tendency in pro-Zionist activism that swept across Canada, America, Latin America, and beyond during the late 1940s. What was at stake was the creation of Israel itself as a sovereign political entity and independent of the British, who, until 1948, had controlled mandatory Palestine in accordance with treaties set up at the end of World War I. When the British mandate ended in May 1958, Israel declared itself independent and immediately entered into conflict with the Palestinians and a coalition of Arab forces. Those fighting to create Israel were able to assert themselves so forcefully, largely because of the careful groundwork that had been laid out in advance by a number of individuals and groups, many of them working in the shadows. Such was the historical mission of the Haganah, defense, an organized Zionist paramilitary network that had been set up by the Jewish Agency, an activist branch of the World Zionist Organization. The Jewish Agency, under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, oversaw the creation of numerous towns, villages, communal outposts, and defense groups in mandatory Palestine. The Jewish Agency would later atrophy, only to be relaunched by one of Leslie Wexner's mentors, Max Fisher, in 1970. Oh, this is about to get interesting. The formation of the Haganah in 1920 was a major step forward towards the formation of the Israeli state. Vital to its functioning was the training and arms provided by the British military. Major General Ord Charles Wingate, who had been dispatched to help administer British control over the territories, worked closely with the Haganah. Wingate even organized joint British Army Zionist paramilitary and commando units dedicated to controlling and suppressing Arab elements in the region. These were called the Special Night Squads. In 1945, the Haganah began its effort to stockpile weapons, ammunition, aircraft, non-lethal supplies, and machine tools sourced from around the globe. In the U.S., Ben-Gurion reached out to a close associate, Zionist activist Rudolf Sonborn, who had traveled to Palestine years earlier to survey the construction of Jewish villages on behalf of the World Zionist Organization. Under the leadership of Sonborn, 18 or so Jewish millionaires and billionaires were recruited into bankrolling the supply effort. Thus, the Sonneborn Institute, as it was known, was born. Wow. The Institute, an activist collaboration of Zionist millionaires and billionaires that pursued specific Zionism-related causes, would later serve as a sort of a model for the Mega Group, founded years later by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman in 1991. The Sonneborn Institute's chief asset was a Haganah operative named Yehuda Arazi. During World War II, he served as a soldier in the Jewish Brigade, a British Army unit that recruited its fighters from the immigrant populations living in Mandatory Palestine. By 1945, he was an old hand at gun running. Indeed, Arazi had been active smuggling arms for the Haganah into Palestine from Europe since 1938. Through these efforts, he developed an impressive roster of contacts, many of whom were tapped to set up front companies through which the Sonneborn Institute and the Haganah could carry out their activities. Ricky Dale Calhoun wrote that one Arazi associate was Leonard Weissman, who was probably a member of the Sonneborn Group. Weissman was a 34-year-old from Pittsburgh who had made a fortune in scrap metals and construction materials. His businesses included Materials Redistribution Company, a firm that dealt in scrap machinery, Paragon Design and Development Corporation, a company that traded in building materials, and Pratt Steamship Lines. A fourth Weissman company, Foundry Associates Incorporated, existed only on paper. All assisted in the purchase and illegal export of arms from the United States. Other front companies were organized by Nathan Bernstein, an attorney in New York City, that were used to source weapons and or construct them from spare parts and then export them overseas. Bernstein's name can be found on the corporate registration of firms like Machinery Processing and Converting Company, which provided cover for the purchase and illegal export of arms-making machines as well as armaments. And Oved Trading Company, which supplied legal cover for buying and transporting explosives. Wow. There was also a trio of interlaced companies: Materials for Palestine, Inland Machinery and Metal Company, and the Eastern Development Company. Materials for Palestine was a charity through which money could be raised, while Inland Machinery actively shipped armaments and lethal munitions. Eastern Development, meanwhile, exported legal non-military goods and machinery to Palestine as relief supplies. There is a possibility that Paul Helliwell, there goes that name, discussed in Chapter 1, had some connection to this company, as he was listed as the attorney for the similarly named Eastern Development Corporation. According to a 1951 article in the Miami News, this Eastern Development was doing business in Florida, but had been formed in Pittsburgh. Oh, This is, wow. As mentioned above, Leonard Weissman, the probable Sonneborn Group member who worked with Arazi to create fronts for arms exporting, was also from Pittsburgh. The potential presence of Helliwell in this mesh leads naturally to another question. Was organized crime also involved in these efforts? Unlike the mysteries around Eastern Development, the role of organized crime in converting army in Haganah is well documented. As these unofficial arms trade networks spread across the U.S., gangsters and mobsters, many of whom actively identified with the Zionist cause, threw their hats into the ring. Early on, Arazi forged ties with Meyer Lansky. Here we go again with that name, Meyer Lansky, requesting aid in maritime transit for the arms. Lansky, in turn, contacted two of his associates who controlled New York City's docks and the Longshoremen's Union, Albert Anastasia and Joe Adonis. Joe Adonis. The trio then helped Israeli agents conceal the arms purchased for Israel, while arms bound for Egypt mysteriously fell overboard. Right. Lansky's close associate, Bugsy Siegel, met with Reuven Daphne, a representative of the Haganah looking to raise funds. Daphne, as the story goes, told Siegel that the Zionists were looking to unshackle themselves from British rule and that the path to do this was to fight. Siegel told Daphne, "I'm with you," and for several weeks onwards, the Haganah would receive suitcases filled with $5 and $10 bills, $50,000 in all. Besides Lansky, one of the more active mobsters in the flow of arms was Joseph Beonjo Ziccarelli. So a lot of mobsters involved in this cause here. According to files obtained from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Ziccarelli was alleged to have been involved in the traffic of arms and munitions sold to the government of Israel. It was one of many destinations for Ziccarelli's arms. He also brokered arms sales to Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. The latter, as will be discussed shortly, was also active in the acquisition of arms for Israel. Ziccarelli was close to Carmine Galante, a key player in the Bonanno Mafia family, who would later become one of Roy Cohn's main clients from the criminal underworld. Roy Cohn? Damn. Allegedly, Ziccarelli had been the subject of a feud between Charles Taruni of the Genovese family and Galante, with each wanting to recruit him into their crime family. Galante won out, and it was under his watch that Ziccarelli's lucrative arms trade flourished. At one point in the 1950s, Ziccarelli was dispatched to Montreal by Galante to work with the Canadian mobster Vincenzo Controni. Together, Ziccarelli and Controni organized the import of large sums of heroin into the country as part of the Canadian wing of the French Connection. Ziccarelli was also alleged to be a close business associate of Louis Rosenstiel. There goes that name again. Rosenstiel's fourth wife, Sarah Kaufman, testified that Ziccarelli had been a secret partner in New Jersey warehouses owned by Shenley Industries, Rosenstiel's company. She further alleged that Rosenstiel had meetings with Ziccarelli and Meyer Lansky. The connection to Shenley signals Ziccarelli's penchant for involving himself in quasi-legitimate businesses that act as both above-board profit turners and as fronts for less than reputable activities. Another one of these businesses was Abco Vending, a cigarette vending machine company that was controlled by Ziccarelli and Galante. Joining them there was Erwin Steve Schwartz, who would later become infamous in the 1970s for his involvement in costly stock munition schemes. FBN files describe Schwartz as representing the Galante-Ziccarelli interests in the arms traffic, promotion, and sales of worthless stocks and securities in the cigarette vending business. Before adding that, since 1946, Schwartz has been engaged in the traffic of arms, a good portion which had been obtained from the communist bloc nations and shipped first to Israel and later Cuba. Associated with Schwartz in these ventures were Irving Schindler and Adolf Schwimmer. Wow. Adolf Al Schwimmer was the founder of the Israel Aircraft Industries, one of the country's great military contractors known today as Israel Aerospace Associates, IAI. During the 1930s, he worked for Lockheed and TWA, and after World War II broke out, he was affiliated in some capacity with the U.S. Air Transport Command. Schwimmer would later remain active through the decades, with a tendency to crop up in various Cold War-era covert operations. Perhaps most notoriously, he emerged as a key player on the Israeli side of the Iran-Contra affair, and by some accounts was the individual who conceived of the arms for hostages plot at the center of Oliver North's complicated web. As for IAI, it would later become owned, years later, by Israel's richest man, Shaul Eisenberg. Under Eisenberg, IAI would have close ties to Israeli intelligence, from which he drew most of the company's senior staff. In his work securing materials for the Haganah, Schwimmer worked closely with Erwin Swifty Schindler. Schindler owned an air freight company called Service Air, which Schwimmer relocated to California with funds from the Haganah. Together, Schwimmer and Schindler utilized the company as a means of acquiring aircraft and aircraft parts to be shipped to Palestine. Yet, with an embargo in place due to President Truman's declaration of neutrality, Service Air was prohibited from sending them overseas. Schwimmer and Schindler, aided by Arazi, turned to the Haganah's contacts in Panama. Damn, they're everywhere. Soon, legal ownership of the airplanes was transferred to the newly established Panamanian national airline, LAPSA, allowing the aircraft to be legally flown to Panama, and from there, they were moved abroad. In Chapter 7, which details the Iran-Contra affair, Israel's close-knit relationship with Panama is mentioned in greater detail. Yet, the origins of this relationship began here, with the efforts of the Haganah to arm Zionist forces in Palestine following World War II. It wasn't, however, the only country in that region to have similar connections to Israel. Many of the people discussed in this chapter, like Bayon Joe Ziccarelli, were actively working with anti-communist forces in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and elsewhere at the same time that they were working with the Haganah. One particularly important anti-communist force that was collaborating with the Haganah was the Somoza regime in Nicaragua. Wow. The special relationship between the Zionist cause and Somoza's Nicaragua was largely due to the heavy presence of United Fruit, the New York-Boston banana trading company whose influence in Latin America was to be fundamentally intertwined with the CIA's activities in the region. CIA everywhere organized crime. No surprise there. In 1933, United Fruit had fallen under the control of Samuel Zemure, whose Cuyamel Fruit Company, a favorite of top Wall Street firms like Lehman and Goldman Sachs, had merged with the company several years prior. Zemure, during the 1940s, was a big backer of Zionist causes, He aided the supply of arms to the Haganah and reportedly helped the organization acquire the SS Exodus, a steamship used to ferry refugees to Palestine, in 1946. United Fruit, which later became United Brands, is discussed throughout this book due to its persisting intelligence connections, as well as the fact its main leadership later included members of Leslie Wexner's inner circle and his two main mentors, Max Fisher and A. Alfred Taubman. Interesting. Let's proceed. By 1947, as Truman's embargo began to be enforced, Nicaragua started providing arms to the Haganah. Somoza reportedly profited directly from this venture. He received 3.5% commission on all arms purchases made by the Haganah under Nicaraguan aegis. A decade later, Israel returned the favor when Shimon Peres negotiated an arms deal with Somoza that transformed Israel's emergent military-industrial complex into the primary supplier of weapons for Nicaragua. As will be discussed in Chapter 7, Israel was active in arming and training the Nicaraguan Contras, the U.S.-backed paramilitary forces that opposed the Sandinista government, which had toppled the Somoza regime in the late 1970s. Regime change, doesn't that sound familiar? The entry of Israel into this conflict was guaranteed by this precise history, and the Reagan administration, as part of its propaganda campaign, was quick to paint the new Sandinista-led government as violently anti-Semitic. The relationship between the Haganah and Latin America wasn't solely dependent on the graces of Zamora and United Fruit, reportedly. Haganah officers called upon the businesses of Sam Kay, a Florida businessman and real estate developer who had extensive contacts in Panama, Batistas, Cuba, and elsewhere. FBI files describe Kay as a reputed international gangster, and one of his close business associates was the Miami Beach hotel impresario Morris Landsberg, who was himself a frontman for Meyer Lansky. Kay would later be linked to Florida mob business Santo Traficante, though the two were purported to have had a falling out that would almost cost Kay his life. It was at this point where the Zionist interest melded with organized crime's real estate ventures, casino operations, and slush funds at the door of the Caribbean. Soon, these connections would truly begin to sprawl outwards and become intercontinental in scope. That was the end of that part of state building. Now we're getting into the hot money web. And it's about to get hot. During the Second World War, writes Jim Hogan, Tibor Rosenbaum became a hero for the resistance through his activities on behalf of the Jews. Using Istvan Lukács as a nom de guerre, he carried out a series of Mission Impossible rescues. In one instance, he posed as a high-ranking Nazi officer, entered a concentration camp, and under administrative pretext, obtained the release of 30 doomed prisoners. His subsequent actions, however, were less than heroic. With high-level connections secured through his position as a delegate for the World Zionist Congress, Rosenbaum set up his Geneva Bank, International Credit Bank, ICB regularly moved money for Mossad and for Israel's Ministry of Defense. The British Sunday Times later reported in 1975 that as much as 90% of the Israeli Defense Ministry's external budget flowed through Rosenbaum's bank. It also moved money for organized crime. In 1967, an expose in Life magazine fingered ICB as a recipient of large sums of money skimmed off by the mob from the casinos they owned in Las Vegas, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. Overseeing the complex chains of interbank relations and transfer chains that enabled this hot money to flow around the globe was a series of banking institutions controlled by Meyer Lansky frontmen. The setup was essentially as follows. Casino skim, as well as profits generated by the drug trade and other organized crime rackets, was moved into two key offshore banks, the Bank of World Commerce and Atlas Bank, the latter of which was a subsidiary of Rosenbaum's ICB. The funds would then be moved to accounts held by ICB in Geneva, where they would be converted into loans and investments to complete the money laundering loop. As will be discussed shortly, some of these funds have been used to finance real estate investments that were made by people connected to American and Israeli intelligence. The organizer of Atlas, on behalf of ICB, was Sylvain Ferdman. The expose in Life described by Ferdman as a Swiss citizen who is an international banker and economist, before adding that U.S. authorities had marked Ferdman a fugitive, accused of interfering with federal inquiry into the skimming racket. Working alongside Ferdman and Rosenbaum was a coterie of Lansky's closest associates. Sitting on the board of ICB itself was Ed Levinson and John Pullman. Levinson, who was partnered with Lansky in the Miami International Airport Hotel, ran the mob-controlled Fremont Hotel Casino in Las Vegas. Levinson was also tight with Clifford Jones, the lieutenant governor of Nevada between 1947 and 1954, who was also an alleged associate of Meyer Lansky. Talk about infiltration into legit affairs in businesses. Sitting alongside Levinson on the ICB board was John Pullman, Lansky's personal financial advisor. Pullman was also close to Lou Chesler, having become acquainted with the Canadian businessman in the 1940s. He subsequently introduced Chesler into Lansky's orbit. Soon, Chesler began managing Lansky's interests in the Bahamas, introducing the development of hotels and casinos. At the same time, Pullman was organizing the Bank of World Commerce, the partner bank to Atlas Bank and corresponding bank to ICB. Levinson and Pullman also sat on the board of BWC. An IRS report aptly described this bank as having been set up to maintain a liquid supply of funds to be used for setting up new gambling casinos in the Caribbean wherever and whenever the opportunity presents itself. They were joined on the board by Benjamin Siegelbaum, a money courier for Lansky and a prominent figure in organized crime circles in his own right. Besides BWC, Siegelbaum held posts at the Exchange and Investment Bank, a sort of Geneva-based counterpart bank to Rosenbaum's ICB. R.T. Naylor, in his book Hot Money in the Politics of Debt writes that, for a time, Exchange and Investment Bank was Lansky's preferred financial institution. At least his role in the bank was accidentally exposed by Chase Manhattan. This occurred after the bank found two of their employees using accounts there to spirit away embezzled funds. It was at this point that Lansky shifted the bulk of his business to Rosenbaum's bank. This is getting really interesting here. Aside from Geneva banking, Siegelbaum also dabbled in Florida real estate. There we go again, real estate. His money backed one of the state's large landowners, Major Realty, which had been co-founded in part by a Florida entrepreneur named Max Orovitz. Orovitz was, as Jonathan Marshall points out, a legitimate businessman and an honored Jewish philanthropist, but no stranger to criminals. He was partnered with Lou Chesler in both Florida real estate, albeit via Chesler's General Development Company, not Major Realty, and in development projects in the Bahamas that ultimately spawned Resorts International, which was previously Mary Carter Paint and had been linked to both the mob, to former New York Governor Thomas Dewey, and to Paul Halliwell's Castle Bank. Orovitz was part of what was known as the Miami Group, a circle of organized crime-linked Jewish businessmen with holdings across various economic sectors in Florida and in Israel. Members of the Miami Group established Dan Hotels, a luxury hotel chain with locations in Israel and India, and also set up Israel's first successful oil drilling company, Israel Oil Ventures. Israel Oil Ventures expanded its capacities considerably in 1960 when it purchased Israel American Oil Corp., an oil venture that was intimately tied to organized crime via its holding in another oil firm, Rimrock Tidelands. A subsidiary of Rimrock Tidelands, Rimrock International, was of interest to a Senate investigation into international narcotics traffic. This was because Rimrock International's managing director was Santos Sorge, who was described in the Senate report as one of the most important mafia leaders and a liaison between American and Sicilian mafia clans. Compared to its fellow dark money conduits, Atlas Bank, later renamed the Atlas Trust, is something of a mystery. It not only sat at the intersection of Geneva-bound money flows, but was also tied to hot money from the Middle East. According to Alan Block, Atlas was united in some shadowy way with Intra-Bank in Beirut, Lebanon, which maintained its own offshore entity in the Bahamas called Intra-Bahamas Trust Limited. Intra-Bank was formed in 1951 by Yusuf Beitas, a Christian Palestinian refugee who had been born into a prominent banking family. Just over a decade later, what began as a modest operation ballooned into a sprawling empire, at which point Beitas formed agreements with leading American banks. These included Bank of America and Chase Manhattan, and Beitas then placed branches of Intrabank in the world's important hotspots for hot money: London, Geneva, and the Caribbean. At home, in Lebanon, Intra held 20% of the country's total deposits and 56% of all the country's banked assets. There was also a deep relationship between Intrabank and illicit activities of all types. As Jonathan Marshall notes, Smugglers of all sorts availed themselves of intrabank services. It was a prime depository for many of the world's leading arms traffickers who received financing from Lebanese traders for illegal weapons sales in southern Arabia Peninsula, Yemen and Aden, Cyprus, Sudan, Nigeria, Rhodesia, South Africa, and Kurdish communities in the Middle East. Wealthy Arabs with too many petrodollars on their hands, looking for a savvy bank in the region to look after their wealth, fattened its deposits further. Lebanon was prized as a haven for cash for anybody with a balance to hide. U.S. tax evaders, oil-rich sheiks who want to lay something by for the rainy day of revolution, and assorted racketeers and purveyors of stolen or smuggled wealth from all over the world. Observed Life magazine in 1967. Naturally, this sort of environment made Intrabank an attractive financial institution for the CIA, and the bank helped transform Beirut into a core hub for the agency's covert operations in the Middle East. Marshall reports that Bates in particular had a personal touch when it came to dealing with the CIA. He was even seen taking CIA officers into his private office to handle their checks. Sitting on the board of directors in Intrabank was Kamal Adham, the head of Saudi intelligence and the cousin of the infamous arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, a later key player in Iran-Contra, the BCCI affair, and numerous other covert activities. According to the Congressional BCCI report, Adnan was the CIA's principal liaison for the entire Middle East from the 1960s through 1979. Intrabank was identified by American law enforcement as being a major laundromat and source of funding for the global drug trade, a sizable portion of which was based in Lebanon. This was thanks to the country's position as a key node in the famed French Connection, as Lebanon was a major source of hashish, raw opium, and even refined heroin that was destined for black markets in Europe and North America. This node of the international drug trade was largely controlled by Samuel Khoury and his partner, Omar Makouk. They had forged close ties to the Lebanese political establishment and law enforcement community, generating an atmosphere of generalized corruption that gained Khoury the nickname Untouchable. Khoury's ties soon expanded overseas. According to a CIA report, Corsican organized crime figures allied with Khoury had made inroads into the highest levels of French government, industry, and society, including the cabinet, police, and military. Khoury also enjoyed protection from Israel. James Addy, an agent of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics assigned to the Middle East, reported that the drug lord had provided thousands of guns to Israel and that the country had provided the contacts and money that enabled Khoury to move narcotics across Europe. Intriguingly, another figure implicated by the FBN in the flow of drugs from Lebanon to Europe was the banker Edmond Safra, whose connection to BCCI, Iran-Contra, and figures like Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein is discussed in Chapter 7. Safran was also a Zionist with strong ties to Israel. For instance, during the 1980s, he served on the board of overseers of B'nai B'rith International, seated alongside figures like Edgar A. Brofman and Max Fisher. One of Intrabank's most lucrative holdings was the Casino du Liban, a gambling establishment outside of Beirut. The casino was a hot spot for the international jet set, as well as a meeting place for various figures from the underworld, who regularly rubbed shoulders with elites. According to Jonathan Marshall, the Casino du Liban was a favorite playground for Saudi sheiks and rich Arab businessmen, such as Adnan Khashoggi. It was also a favorite gathering place for foreign businessmen, diplomats, and spies. Jim Hogan, meanwhile, writes that the casino at its height was said to be the biggest gambling emporium in the world, dwarfing the Sands, the Dunes, the Flamingo, and Monte Carlo. At the Casino du Liban, gambling concessions were held by Marcel Francisi, the leader of the Corsican underworld. In the 1940s, Francisi aligned himself with Sami Khoury, and prior to his murder in 1968, he forged a close working relationship between French and Italian gangsters. Mr. Heroin, as he was known by American authorities, was the man with the international perspective. As a result of his other connections to Francisi and others, Khoury did perhaps more than anyone to maintain the French Connection drug pipeline. Francisi was also a partner with Meyer Lansky, who was likewise known to haunt the Casino du Liban from time to time. Intrabank's peculiarities make a little more sense when one considers that, for bankers and organized criminals alike, there is often money to be made on both sides of any given conflict. After all, this was a bank that had been founded by someone who had fled the Haganah's activities in Palestine, and a casino that, according to Jim Hogan, would siphon money off to finance the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. Yet, at the same time, Zionist-aligned gangsters, bankers, and other figures were caught up in its web. This apparent contradiction was ultimately indicative of a trend that would grow in the 1970s and 1980s. A behind-the-scenes alignment between the ruling elites of Arab societies, enriched by the petrodollar system, and the Israeli business class and security apparatus. This tension-filled, often contradictory and ever-shifting alignment was of considerable interest to the U.S., which often found itself serving as a mediator between these two forces. The U.S., of course, would use that role as its pivot point in its attempts to dominate the Middle East. This environment was fertile soil for crooks, businessmen, and operatives of all types, many of whom were interlaced with the command structures of Western and sometimes Eastern intelligence services. Now we're getting deeper into this with the next part. Bankers and Tankers, the world of Bruce Rappaport. While he was President Ronald Reagan's director of the CIA, William Casey maintained, much to the chagrin of many in the agency, an informal intelligence apparatus composed of his close friends and associates, nicknamed the Hardy Boys. This group lacked CIA clearances, but its members had their own backdoor, so to speak, into Langley. Yeah, quite the tangled web. It is quite the tangled web. They would ride upstairs into Casey's own elevator. Among this clique was Max Hugel, who managed to be appointed deputy deputy director of the CIA, before his history of dubious stock trading caught up with him. Hugo makes a brief appearance later in Chapter 10. Other members who will be discussed in later chapters of this book included John Shaheen and Robert B. Anderson. Shaheen, an oil trader, played a role in the October Surprise affair, while Robert B. Anderson's career veered from being a prominent figure in the Eisenhower administration to being disbarred for money laundering in 1980s. One of Casey's most important friends, however, was Bruce Rappaport. Across the later half of the 20th century, Rappaport left a string of business deals that were mind-numbing in their complexity and tied to fraud, intelligence-linked bust-out operations, and backroom dealings, all of which were facilitated by a sophisticated web of interlocking shipping companies, banks, oil companies, mines, and numerous other holdings. Rappaport and Casey were sometimes co-participants in these activities, some of which predated Casey's time at the CIA. During the 1980s, they were also known to be golfing buddies and made frequent visits together to the Deepdale Golf Club on Long Island. When Rappaport visited Deepdale, writes Alan Block, the author of an exhaustive study on his life and times, his chauffeur was often Louis Filardo, an alleged associate of New York area mobsters. By the late 1980s, if not earlier, he was tied to Russian organized crime interests, including Semyon Mogilevich, the boss of bosses of Russian crime syndicates, who makes several appearances later in this book. With a position on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, Mogilevich is described by the Bureau as a leader in weapons trafficking, contract murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and prostitution on an international scale. Interestingly, it is quite possible that Rappaport had been introduced to Mogilevich by none other than Robert Maxwell, who, by the 1980s, had become a key business partner of Mogilevich's and facilitated Mogilevich's entry into the Israeli and U.S. financial systems. Another contact of Mogilevich's crime networks was the aforementioned banker Edmund Safra, who was acquainted with both Maxwell and Rappaport. Rappaport's origins are murky, though a few facts are known. He was born in Haifa, Palestine, in 1922 to a family that had settled there from Ukraine. At some point, he earned a law degree and spent time as a judge after Israel's founding. He also served in the IDF, achieving the rank equivalent to major. His military career, however, had begun before the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. Rappaport has stated that he spent a portion of World War II fighting with the British Army, who dispatched him to Africa. He may have been a member of the African Auxiliary Pioneer Corps, later shortened to the African Pioneer Corps. The Corps had existed from 1941 until 1946 and had started off as a logistics support unit that gradually expanded to include combat capabilities. Many of the African pioneers were attached to the Ninth Army, one of the British field armies that was part of the Middle East Command. Rappaport was also reportedly a member of the Special Interrogation Group, SIG, the British commando group made up Jewish volunteers from Mandatory Palestine. SIG recruited heavily from the ranks of the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Special Night Squads. After the war, Rappaport joined the 6th Airborne Division, another British Army outfit. This was an airborne infantry division that had been deployed to Palestine in the late 1940s and worked closely with Jewish groups in the region to administer the territories until Israel's creation in 1948. The 6th Airborne, which had a fairly significant casualty rate among its personnel, worked to regulate and balance the competing interests of Jewish and Arab factions in the region, while also laying the logistical groundwork for the steady influx of refugees from Europe. During his time with the 6th Airborne, Rappaport helped organize Israel's military police. Soon, however, he began to focus more on his interest, the world of criminal enterprises and covert operations. According to Alan Block, a Scotland Yard report provided some of the earliest known information on Rappaport's shadier activities, charging that in the early 1950s, Rappaport and Teddy Kollek, who became the charismatic mayor of Jerusalem, devised a scam on construction materials serious enough to produce warrants. Israeli newspapers reported a similar story, but sometimes Paul Kollek, Teddy's brother, was instead identified as Rappaport's partner, regardless of which Kollek was actually involved. Rappaport's proximity to the Kollek brothers points to his own proximity to the centers of power in nascent Israel. This connection is also one that leads back to the Haganah in the intermixing of intelligence and organized crime. Teddy Kollek, in the 1940s, ran the day-to-day operations of the arms procurement in New York for the Haganah, which brought him into contact with the city's criminal elements. His close contacts included Al Schwimmer and Yehuda Erazi. He worked with the two in delivering aircraft to Israel by way of intermediaries in South America. Kollek's activities put him on the radar of British intelligence, and their interest in him was multifold. On the one hand, he was treated with suspicion. His phone was bugged, his bags were searched, and his movements were consistently tracked. On the other hand, he was actively courted by MI5, first indirectly, and then later directly. Kollek's main contact with British intelligence was through an MI5 officer named Simkin. The two had a mutual friend, Ben Aharon, who was reportedly an ardent Bolshevik who would subsequently become head of the Histadrut, the centralized body of that coordinated Israel's trade unions. Aharon's wife, Miriam, worked for the Shah, the intelligence apparatus of the Haganah. After his scam with one of the Kollek brothers went bust, Rappaport fled Israel. Over the course of his lifetime, he held passports for numerous countries. He was listed as a citizen for Panama, Costa Rica, Israel, and Switzerland. It was the later location where he settled down in the early 1950s. Early supports for his Swiss ventures came from the Société Générale de Surveillance, SGS, a Geneva-based multinational that provides inspection and verification services for international trade. Besides SGS, another entity that helped Rappaport launch his early activities was Swiss Israel Trade Bank, headquartered in Geneva. According to Rappaport, he knew Swiss Israel's owner, who provided him with loans. Interestingly, the bank's original founder and owner, likely who Rappaport was referring to, was Gideon Persky. Gideon was the brother of Shimon Peres, the leading Israeli Labor Party politician, who would later serve as both president and prime minister of the country and become a close friend of Robert Maxwell and later his daughter Isabel. The hell? Years later, Ehud Barak, who would later serve as Israel's defense minister and prime minister, alleged that Shimon Peres had been the person who had originally introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein. Shimon, a veteran of the Haganah, had joined the IDF towards the end of the 1940s and was appointed by David Ben-Gurion as the chief purchaser of munitions for Israel's military. By 1953, Shimon headed Israel's Ministry of Defense. According to Jonathan Nitzan and Shimshon Bichler, Shimon's control over defense spending greatly benefited the business of his brother. That Swiss Israel helped prop up Rappaport is significant, as it was effectively a Mossad front in Europe. Overseeing the bank's daily operations was Yehuda Asiya, who was actively on the Mossad payroll. Under his direction, the bank both raised funds for the bank and acted as a conduit for the financing of its international operations. It was also utilized to raise money for the construction of nuclear reactors that played a major role in Israel's covert construction of nuclear weapons. Avner Cohen, in his book Israel and the Bomb, writes that Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres conducted the management of funds outside the official state budget and had enlisted the aid of an American Jewish fundraiser and businessman named Abraham Feinberg to locate private donors. Feinberg ran American Bank and Trust, a subsidiary of Swiss Israel. There are other lines running from Swiss Israel to the worlds of organized crime and, unsurprisingly, the Helliwell's banking complex. Prior to his relocation to Geneva to take over the operations of Swiss Israel, Yehuda Asiya spent World War II in Thailand, where he met General Phao Siananda. During the 1950s, Phao spent a considerable amount of time in Geneva, where he lived with Asiya. As mentioned in Chapter 1, Phao was closely connected to Helliwell and stood at a nexus of American intelligence's complexity in the opium trade during the post-war period. In 1960, Asiya was contacted by Irving Davidson, a powerful lobbyist whose clients included the CIA, the Teamster, once again, that mentioning of the Teamsters, Texas oil giant Clinton Murchison, and the State of Israel, concerning a Bahamian bank called Guarantee Trust Company. Guarantee Trust was run by a major supporter of Israel named A. Moulter, and was one of the offshore entities that handled hot money flows from the Teamsters Pension Fund and from other organized criminal activities, such as the skim from casinos. The vice chairman of the bank was Leonard Burstyn, a former director of Miami National Bank, which, as previously mentioned in Chapter 1, had been founded with the aid of a loan from the Teamster Pension Fund and had employed the services of Paul Helliwell's law firm. With these early ties, Rappaport's empire began to expand in all directions, interlocking with shipping and financial interests all over the world. Services and International Maritime Supplies Company Limited. Wow, let me repeat that again. This process began in 1959 with the creation of International Maritime Services and International Maritime Supplies Company Limited. The latter company was closely linked to a shipping concern in the UK called Wilson, London and International Limited, which was soon joined by a trio of major maritime companies. These were Per Allen Block, a Dutch company, NS Frank and Zoon, NV, the American Maritime Supply Service Incorporated, based in Chicago, and the Italian Maritime Supplies Company Limited. Rappaport noted with glee that with 3 other firms buying into international maritime, it would be possible to have a shipping clientele of 161 firms that will cover the entire world. In those early years, Rappaport formed what would be a lifelong connection to the Kouloukounis family, a Greek shipping clan who had set up shop in the United States and in Great Britain. Michael Kouloukounis was the co-organizer of International Maritime Supplies, and court documents show that, as early as 1961, the pair were using the company to run scams and loot the coffers of unsuspecting businesses. At the same time, the Kouloukounis family advanced their own shipping interests through London and overseas freighters, which in time would boast an impressive fleet of tankers that played a significant role in the global oil trade. Some of the affairs of the Kouloukounis family will be discussed in Chapter 6. In the early 1960s, Intermaritime Supplies owned a stake in London and overseas freighters. It is worth mentioning that London and overseas was formed by the Kouloukounis family with their cousins, the Marvolian family. As will be noted in Chapter 15, the Marvolians were themselves connected to the circles around Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Damn. For several years, Ghislaine Maxwell dated Gianfranco Ciccone, whose mother had been married to the patriarch of the Marvolian family, and the original founder of London Overseas, Basil Bluey Marvolian. Contact information for Bluey Marvolian and his son, Nicholas Marvolian, Gianfranco's half-brother, can be found in Epstein's Black Book of Contacts. It wasn't until 1965 that Rappaport set up the institution that would later stand at the center of his complex network of firms and money conduits, Intermaritime Bank, IMB. IMB, writes Block, had A and B shareholders. The various holders of Class B stock were representatives of banking institutions that were in business with Rappaport. These included Klaus Polstra, representing Bank M, representing Bank M Emden, and Rolando Zappi, representing Weiss Credit, a bank in the Swiss canton of Ticino. Nestled near the border of Switzerland and Italy, Weiss Credit was identified by the U.S. State Department as a bank utilized by numerous Italians involved with organized crime to hide the company to run scams and loot the coffers of unsuspecting businesses. To hide their money. Sorry, I'm going to read that again. Nestled near the border of Switzerland and Italy, Weiss Credit was identified by the U.S. state government as a bank utilized by numerous Italians involved with organized crime to hide their money from financial authorities in their home country. Zoppi would wind up with a 5-year prison sentence in 1975 when Weiss Credit lost some $150 million, $150 million of depositors' money due to fraud and mismanagement of high-risk speculative operations. Another holder of Class B stock was David Hodara from the Swiss financial outfit Sophagest. Sophagest would later be involved in the strange affairs of Investors Overseas Services, an international mutual fund and capital flight apparatus with ties to Tibor Rosenbaum and Meyer Lansky. Later, Sophagest would emerge in Brazil, where it was involved in everything from a joint venture with Fiat to frauds perpetrated by the infamous Naji Nahas. When it came to the holders of Class A stock, things were a bit more limited. The bulk was held by Rappaport himself, albeit filtered through various other companies that he either owned or controlled. The rest were held by E.P. Barry, the OSS veteran who, as mentioned in Chapter 1, was one of the primary figures in Paul Helliwell's Florida banking network. Fact, at the same time that Harry was involved with EMT, that Barry was involved with HMT Florida Shares, the holding company for some of Helliwell's banks. He came to hold IMB Class A shares. This link to the world of Helliwell would endure. One of Rappaport's chief financial allies and the architect of a large number of his ventures was Helliwell's banking partner, Burton Cantor, also an affiliate of the mob. Damn, this is getting even more tangled. Whew. Over the decades, there has been a slow and steady trickle of news articles in major publications that examine Bruce Rappaport. In 1988, the New York Times published an article on Rappaport entitled "The Secret Emperor of Oil and Shipping." The article described how Rappaport had developed a reputation for both openness and secrecy. On one hand, Mr. Rappaport, who is said by some associates to be a billionaire, sponsors golf and tennis tournaments and gives huge sums of host of charities, especially medical and Jewish ones. On the other hand, former and current business associates of Mr. Rappaport is involved in hundreds of companies registered in remote places like Liberia and Panama to run his banking, shipping, and oil empire. The appearance of Rappaport in Liberia is particularly interesting. It was there that he had established one of his many intermaritime outfits. In this case, it was Intermaritime Owners Corporation of Monrovia. Liberia was a favorite for owners of shipping companies. Besides the low taxes, the astoundingly lax regulation, and the degree of bank secrecy, the country boasts a robust flags of convenience system, which allows ship owners to register their vessels in an alternative sovereign to their place of origin. Okay. Liberia's shipping registry system also has some unique characteristics. It was managed not in Liberia itself, but it was overseen by an international bank located in Washington, D.C. The longtime controller of International Bank, George Olmsted, would end up on the periphery of the BCCI affair discussed later in Chapter 7. Rappaport wasn't a lone figure in this network with ties to Liberia. In fact, there's every indication that Liberia was of immense importance to a number of the individuals that have been discussed in this chapter. Tibor Rosenbaum, for instance, was listed as the managing director of the Swiss Liberian Finance Corporation in 1954. That year, Swiss Liberian Finance Corporation provided a multi-million-dollar line of credit to help capitalize the Bank of Liberia Incorporated, a development bank particularly controlled by the Liberian government. Other capital inflows for the Bank of Liberia came from the Bank of Monrovia and the Liberian Trade and Development Corporation, TradeVco. The Bank of Monrovia had first been owned by the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company before it was acquired by the First National City Bank, an institution controlled by the Rockefeller family. Jesus Christ. TradeVco, meanwhile, was controlled by a group of Italian banks. Tax banking laws and the flags of convenience systems certainly helped attract people to Liberia. Another may have been the lucrative diamond trade. During the 1950s, the country became the primary transshipment point for the flow of diamonds from countries like Sierra Leone to diamond-cutting hubs. Many of these hubs were located in Antwerp and in Israel. In Israel, one of the major banks involved in the financing of the diamond-cutting industry was Bank Leumi, which opened offices and branches in Liberia early on. The board of Bank Leumi reportedly interlocked with that of Rosenbaum's ICB, while Rosenbaum himself was affiliated with Kupat Bank, a subsidiary of Bank Leumi. Serving as honorary consul to Liberia in this period was a man named Louis Mortimer Bloomfield. He was a powerful Canadian attorney with an exhaustive roster of connections to all sorts of elite figures and institutions, starting with the law firm he belonged to, Phillips and Weinberg of Montreal. Through his senior co-partner Lazarus Phillips, it was connected to the Royal Bank of Canada. Libby and Frank Park, in their classic study of the Canadian elite establishment, The Anatomy of Big Business, show that this bank was one of the commanding institutions in Canada and acted as a conduit for the entry of foreign capital originating in the US, the UK, and Belgium. The firm was also closely tied to the Bronfman family. Peter Newman writes in the Bronfman dynasty that because of the many family feuds, two of Montreal's best lawyers, Lazarus Phillips and Philip Weinberg, have become ex-officio members of the family, charged with arbitrating among its several factions. It has been alleged that Bloomfield himself did work on behalf of the Bronfmans. What? While this is by no means outside of the realm of possibility, it is difficult to find evidence to confirm that this particular claim. What is known and extensively documented, however, is Bloomfield's ties to a mysterious entity in Rome that was tied to American, Italian, French, and Israeli intelligence networks, as well as to international organized criminal actors and their banks. Whew. Good grief. Talk about getting tangled all over the world and into government. Mossad Goes to Rome is the final part of this chapter. In 1967, Gershon Perez, a brother of Shimon Peres, joined the board of Centro Mondiale Comercial, CMC, the Italian subsidiary of Permindex, a World Trade Center organization headquartered first in Basel and then in Rome, and made famous by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Ostensibly, the purpose of Permindex CMC was to maintain what was effectively a permanent World's Fair, a centralized site where businessmen could display their wares, deals could be made, and important corporations could maintain offices. On the back end, however, Permindex CMC was tied into various covert networks. What first placed Garrison on the trails of Permindex, for example, was the presence of Clay Shaw, an apparent CIA contract agent, on their board. Italian journalist Michelle Metta, who received the cachet of CMC corporate documents, has shown that Permindex CMC was plunged into the Italian state security apparatus and also had a curious series of connections to Israel. One of CMC's founders, Georges Mandel, also known as Giorgio Mantello, was affiliated with the Banque pour le Commerce Sud-Amérique Centrale, which was identified as having supplied cover employment for Israeli intelligence service agents. Another CMC board member, Alberto Forte, subsequently became managing director of Banque Belgo Centrale, a subsidiary of the Mossad-linked Swiss-Israel Trade Bank. Louis Mortimer Bloomfield has often been described as the founder of Permindex, and sometimes as its dominant shareholder. This seems to be an inaccurate picture of his role in the complex, as Bloomfield was Permindex's attorney. In this capacity, he was responsible for coordinating all the different players involved, who were scattered across multiple continents. He does not appear to have owned a stock of his own in Permindex or CMC. Instead, he acted as a proxy for particular interests, effectively hiding their identities. Their stock was held in his name, and he occupied their spots on the board. With the links between Permindex CMC and the world of intelligence, it is unsurprising that rumors have circulated for decades that Bloomfield was, during the Second World War, a member of the OSS. There is little to corroborate this claim, though he did serve in the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, achieving the rank of major in August 1946. Correspondences in this archive show that he was in communication with the British spy master William Stevenson, there goes that name again, who at the time was active in Canadian industry and finance. Bloomfield did hold member in a number of elite organizations, including the Most Venerable Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, a British chivalric order established by royal charter in the 1880s as something of a Protestant counterpart to the Catholic Sovereign Military Order of Malta, better known as the Knights of Malta. He eventually became both the attorney for and president of the Order's Quebec Council. Bloomfield was also attached to a number of Zionist organizations. He served as honorary counsel to the World Jewish Congress and was active in building up the Canadian branches in the Histadrut, Israel's trade union complex. In addition to organized labor, Bloomfield's concerns involved maritime commerce as well. He was president of the Canadian wing of the Israel Maritime League, set up in the late 1940s to make the people of Israel sea conscious. The Israel Maritime League and the Histadrut were tightly connected. Along with the Jewish Agency, the three organized Zim Shipping, the major transport concern that was a key supplier of weapons and suppliers to Israel in the early days of the state's existence. Later in life, Bloomfield corresponded with George H.W. Bush, including while Bush was serving as a director of the CIA. The letters indicate that the two first met at a meeting at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing in 1975. Bloomfield appears to have had a long-running fascination with China, having traveled there as early as 1966, if not earlier. After that particular trip, he gave public addresses calling for the normalization of diplomatic relations with the country and for increased trade relations between the East and the West. As Maurice Phillips, the first to explore the contents of Bloomfield's activities, points out, Bloomfield's position on China predated that of President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger by a number of years. Another prominent figure in touch with Bloomfield was Tibor Rosenbaum. Permindex documents show that Rosenbaum and his International Credit Bank were deeply involved with Permindex and CMC. A July 12, 1961 memo from Bloomfield to Rosenbaum discusses an adjacent project headed by CMC's founder, Georges Mantello, called Marina Real. Registered in Panama, Marina Real was a holding company utilized by Permindex's principals to acquire real estate. This fascination with real estate in this tangled up web here. Just as with Permindex itself, Bloomfield acted as a proxy for shareholders whose names remain unknown. The communication between him and Rosenbaum, however, identifies some of the other parties with interests tied up in Marina Real. The communication between him and Rosenbaum, however, identifies some of the other parties with interests tied up. Among these were Dov Begun, a leading figure in the World Zionist Organization, who became the National Secretary for the National Committee for Labor Israel. What? Much like Bruce Rappaport and Robert Maxwell, Begun spent World War II in the British Army. According to his obituary, he served in intelligence operations in France, Holland, and Norway. Another investor in Marina Real, and one who received his shares directly from Mantello, was Nate Dolan of Cleveland, Ohio. Dolan achieved notoriety in 1970 when the firm he was connected to, Realty Equities, ran a fraud scheme in conjunction with Rosenbaum's ICB. Interestingly, Dolan had a business relationship with the Lansky-connected mobster Mo Dalitz going back to the 1940s, when they both owned shares of the Cleveland Indians sports team. There were other big names involved in Permindex CMC's real estate deals. Communiques found in Louis Bloomfield's archival papers show that his law partner, Stanley Weinberg, was keeping a close eye on these developments, and perhaps even had a role in these transactions. That superseded that of Bloomfield. These same cables identified a French company called Compagnie Financière as holding a 10% stake in one of the real estate ventures. Compagnie Financière had been set up in 1953 by Francois Perrier, a scion of the famed French banking family, and Edmond de Rothschild, who exerted dominant control over the institution. Today, Compagnie Financière is known as the Edmond de Rothschild Group. Now, Rothschild was also a business partner of Tibor Rosenbaum. The two had organized the Israel Corporation, Israel's largest investment, designed to encourage large-scale private investment in Israel. When it was discovered in 1974 that Rosenbaum had built the company to the tune of $60 million, the Israeli government linked up a small handful of the country's leading banks to participate in efforts to prevent its liquidation. One of these banks was Bank Leumi. Rothschild himself appears all over Bloomfield's correspondences and was clearly intimately involved with Permindex's CMC activities. One cable from Bloomfield to Abraham Friedman at the Israel Continental Oil Corporation in Tel Aviv requested that Friedman discuss matters relevant to the Italian real estate deals with Rothschild. Intriguingly, the Oil and Petroleum Yearbook identifies Israel Continental Oil as having been set up in Canada in 1952, while Canadian government records show that Louis Bloomfield's nephew, Bernard Bloomfield, mentioned earlier as a director of International Credit Bank's subsidiary, Atlas Bank, was the oil producer's president. According to the Jewish Telegraph Agency, a year after Israel Continental Oil was founded, it became a player in a consortium of oil firms looking to drill near the Dead Sea and in other sections of Israel. Other partners in this consortium included Husky Oil Company, which was affiliated with the aforementioned mob-linked Rimrock Tidelands Oil Company, and New Continental Oil Company, with which Israel Continental Oil settled joint ventures in Canada. The president of the New Continental was Frank Kaftel, an organized crime associate and stock manipulator originally from Cleveland, the stomping grounds of Mo Dalitz and CMC investor Nate Dolan. Federal Bureau of Narcotics documents identify Kaftel as a close associate of Beyanjo Ziccarelli, the aforementioned mobster and businessman who had been involved in the running of arms to Israel. Another Canadian-based oil concern active in the Israel petroleum industry of the 1960s was Tricontinental Pipelines, where Edmond de Rothschild, Francois Perrier, and Louis Bloomfield could all be found. Galina Nikitina, in A Political and Economic History of the State of Israel, notes that Tricontinental was part of a group that controlled a pipeline from Eilat to Haifa, the basis for the largest trans-Israel pipeline that linked Israel and Iran, alongside the Miami Group and Palestine Economic Corporation. Damn. Damn. The Miami Group, as mentioned above, maintained ties to organized crime interests and was also connected to the family of companies that was partnered with the Israel Continental Oil Corporation. PEC, on the other hand, was a primary conduit for the investment of American capital into nascent Israeli industries. To quote Nikitina, Described as the largest American private investor in Israel, PEC was formed in 1926 as an instrument through which American Jews could render material assistance to production enterprises in Palestine. In only the period from 1950 to 1959, its capital increased 70%. PEC assets totaled $19,300,000 in 1961. It has numerous daughter companies, bank and agencies, and shares in other companies. Having grown to gigantic proportions, PEC has its tentacles in all the key branches of Israel's economy. PEC is linked with leading financial and industrial monopolies in the USA, such as the Wall Street bankers Lehman Brothers, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, one of the 8 largest financial groups in the USA, the Mellon Group of Pittsburgh, the Cabot Lodge of Boston, and the Hanna Group of Cleveland. Damn. This particular network of individuals and institutions is complex and convoluted. Yet, what is clear is that there was something of an Israel, Italy, France, Canada axis that was tied directly into hot money networks in the Caribbean, to the flow of capital from the West into Israel itself, and to the outflows of raw materials like diamonds from the Third World. Once this foreign investment, generally from American and Canadian sources, was in Israel, it went to work building up various industries. It appears then that the logical successor to the earlier efforts to raise money, supplies, and weapons for the Zionist paramilitary groups in Mandatory Palestine was now all about building up the capacities of the new state. As for the more narrow case of Permandex CMC itself, it is clear how this World Trade Center would have been beneficial for engineering international capital flows and business arrangements of this very nature. At the same time, however, the links between these entities and intelligence services like the CIA, the Italian Special Services, and Mossad also suggest a more covert imperative. Michael Mehta, in his book on Permandex, notes that literally that's what this is. Michael Mehta, in his book on Permandex, notes that in the early 1960s, special arrangements were made between Israel and Italy to support the OAS, the French paramilitary group in Algeria, in return for Italian oil companies getting access to Algerian crude. While the geopolitical implications of this arrangement are wide-ranging, it was also intimately connected to CMC. Leading these secret negotiations was former Italian Prime Minister Fernando Tambroni, whose son-in-law, Mitkucci Cecchi, sat on the board of CMC. On the side of the OAS, the negotiations were reportedly handled by the paramilitary leader Jacques Soustelle. This particular angle emerged during the investigation into the mysterious death of Enrico Mattei, whose plane exploded in October 1962. Mattei was the head of Eni, the dominant oil and gas firm in Italy that supplied, among other things, petroleum to NATO and the U.S. Sixth Fleet. In the early 1960s, however, Mattei had embarked on something of a path different from the status quo of Cold War politics. He sought to sign oil agreements with the Soviet Union and with Algerian and Egyptian interests who were, at the time, opposed to Israel. With such a pivot taking place, theories that Matei's death was less than accidental have existed for decades and have also led to multiple official inquiries into the incident. Italian journalist Fulvio Bellini turned over information allegedly identifying the real culprits to one of these inquiries, headed by the judicial magistrate Vincenzo Caglia. I think to understand the death of Enrico Mattei, Bellini told Caglia, you need to follow the trail of Jacques Soustelle. This was the man given the job of doing Operation Mattei with around $100,000 from Montreal through Permindex. And what then of the connections to organized crime networks? One possibility is that through its connection with Tibor Rosenbaum's International Credit Bank, Permindex CMC was involved with money laundering activities. In one of the earliest exposés of Permindex CMC, published by investigative journalist Mario Ugazzi in the now defunct Paese Sera, a company called the Italo-American Hotel Corporation, IAHC, was identified as an affiliate of CMC. Meta, meanwhile, describes IAHC as a subsidiary of CMC. IAHC was dedicated to high-end real estate development in various locations in Rome. One of its big projects was the Hotel du Lac, curiously located next to ENI's headquarters. Financing for IAHC's projects came from Banca Nazionale del Lavoro, BNL, a bank that, as will be discussed in Chapter 7, was tied to notorious banks like BCCI and Banco Ambrosiano, and also played a role in the flow of weapons to Iraq in the 1980s. The money that BNL handled, however, came from a variety of other sources in Geneva and Liechtenstein. One of these sources was none other than ICB. While this is to be expected given Rosenbaum's numerous ties to Permindex CMC, it does raise questions about the ultimate provenance of this money. Given that ICB was moving the hot money being poured into its correspondent banks into the Caribbean, it is possible that, via these various companies, this money was being put into Italian real estate ventures. Such conclusions are at best speculative. Yet what is certain and undeniable is that much of the wartime OSS and CIA, as well as Israel's intelligence services, operated in close proximity to, and were effectively indistinguishable from, organized crime. What's unique in Israel's case, however, is that such collusion was baked in the What's unique in Israel's case, however, is that such collusion was baked in at the very foundations of not only its intelligence service, but the origins of the state itself. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of Chapter 3 of One Nation Under Blackmail. And again, in this book, there is actually endnotes and links to where all this information comes from other articles and books from the sources that were talked about. And with all this tanglement between the government and organized crime, really, it does make sense. Yeah, it's heavy. It's crazy. CIA, FBI, at this point, let's just call them what it is. No problem at all. Thank you. It's crazy. At this point, the CIA, FBI, let's just call them what they are. They are, the best way to describe it as, for me, state parts of government that are really organized crime. FBI is CIA organized crime. I know, but chapter 4 is a very, 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 very long chapter, which I'll give you a little preview from the title. Chapter 4 is Roy Cohn's Favor Bank. And the next episode I'll be reading on Wednesday. Chapter 4, Roy Cohn's Favor Bank. Thank you. And with that concludes the live reading. And stay cool, y'all.